Okay, we're continuing our discussion of monthly economic indicators. Subsection here is production and capacity indicators. There's two main statistical agencies that I'm going to talk about. One is the federal government and the other is private. So starting off with the federal government source, this comes from the Federal Reserve. They produce industrial-oriented production indexes. So by industrial, I mean mining, manufacturing, and utilities. So it doesn't cover services, and services has become a more important part of the economy, but it does provide detailed coverage of the industrial sector. It asks the question, what is the intensity of factory production, right? And there's another piece of it in this Federal Reserve that I'll talk about in a second that's called capacity utilization. So here is a chart of industrial production, and I've computed the growth rate so we can see the effect or the natural change that you would expect early on in the chart in 2008 and 2009 due to what's called the Great Recession, the recession of 2008 and 9. You can see the bars below the axis there indicating negative growth or a contraction in industrial production. And then after that, you can see a little bit of a rebound and then somewhat meager growth after that, which has been a broad characteristic of the United States economy ever since the 2008-9 recession. What is capacity utilization? So this answers a different question. What fraction of factory productive capability is being utilized? So a little bit of a different kind of a question, and so interpret the numbers a little bit differently. I'm just going to show you the levels. Again, it's only measuring traditional industrial sectors, i.e. mining, manufacturing, and utilities. So here's the chart. And you can see that the productive capacity of the nation in those sectors fell a lot in that recession. Again, same recession I spoke about a minute ago, 2008 and 2009. So capacity had been running just over 80%, but then it went down to like 66 to 67% in the depths of that recession, and then it recovered. And these days, it's in the sort of mid to higher 70% range of capacity utilization. Okay, the other promulgator of this type of data is actually private. It's the Institute of Supply Management. Some number of years ago it was called the National Purchasing Managers Index. For those of you who've been around for a while, in case you heard that. They measured the intensity of production and they release this data quickly. It's released more quickly than the capacity utilization and industrial production that I discussed that comes out from the Federal Reserve System. And then the other interesting thing about ISM is they have a services sector index. This is important because in recent decades, services has become actually more important by some measures than industry in the overall share of the United States economy, and this is true for other developed economies as well. Services are a big deal nowadays. So let's do some charts. Here, the yellow bars are a manufacturing indicator. So that's the traditional manufacturing or industrial-oriented indicator. And then the red line is a services. So you can see they both responded or they both tracked what we know happened in 2008 and 2009 with big declines and then recoveries thereafter. But you can see that they're a little bit different, that there's a distinguishing characteristics in certain years and certain months between the services sector and the manufacturing sector. The previous chart was levels. This chart is growth rates. Durable goods orders. So this, again, is an indicator that focuses on the traditional industrial part of the economy. despite the fact that services is now very large. But people watch it because it's considered potentially more of a leading indicator. So it's advanced durable goods orders is the full name of it, and it's an indicator of what managers think they will be ordering going forward, right? So it's an attempt to create an economic statistic that is very forward-looking. The downside is that it's narrow in its view. It's only durable goods manufacturing. So there's a trade-off there. So it comes from the United States Census Bureau. As I mentioned, it's manufacturing-centric. It's considered a leading indicator, quote unquote, which I'll talk more about leading indicators in the next section. As I mentioned, it's considered very forward-looking. So that's a related statement. So here are a couple of charts. This chart shows the levels. The new orders that really is being referred to by the title on the previous slide is the green line. There are some other types of indicators in this press release, and I've included them in this chart. I won't go off in detail talking about them due to in the interest of time, but there's inventories and shipments type data available in this press release as well. But the green line is the main indicator of interest in this case. You can see, as with the other indicators, that it fell during the recession and has been growing slowly in most periods since. There is some volatility there. These are growth rates. Here you can see there's much, when you do growth rates, you can see that the patterns between shipments, inventories, and new orders are quite substantial. I won't, like I said, I won't dwell on them here in the interest of time. The green line is the key line for the Advanced Durable Goods Orders Report. Okay, as promised, leading indicators. So this is an index. It's an index of many indicators that are brought together into one measure. I'll talk more about it in a second. It's promulgated by the Conference Board, which is a private company. It's not a government agency. And I mention that because really a lot of economic data, macroeconomic data, something on the order of at least 75% easily comes from government agencies. But this is an exception to that, as was ISM. The idea behind leading indicators is to look at all of the indicators that are out there, and this particular exercise is done at the monthly frequency, so it uses monthly frequency data. And pick the ones that seem to lead the broad economy. What do we mean by the broad economy? A quick and dirty measure of the broad economy is GDP. There are more sophisticated measures. For more information on that, go to nber.org, and there's a lot of literature there on how they broadly measure the economy. That is the organization that dates business cycles, right? So they tell us when the recessions start and when they end. Here is the list of the 10 leading economic indicators. So you can see they come from various segments of the economy. There's hours worked. There's initial applications for unemployment insurance, which I talk about more in a section in a moment. There's manufacturers' new orders for consumer goods. There's the speed of delivery of merchandise from vendors to suppliers. New orders for capital goods, which was a section we had a moment ago. Building permits for residential buildings, which is a section in just a little bit that I'll talk about. The S&P 500 stock index, money supply, a interest rate spread, and consumer sentiment. So all of these are indicators that are considered to start turning down, say, if there's a recession coming, before the recession actually comes. So it's thought that there's information there that is useful. So it's one thing to collect all these indicators, but what the Conference Board does is more than that. They combine them into one index with a weighting scheme. In other words, not all of the different 10 indicators are weighted exactly the same. They do that in their proprietary way. So that's not shared, it's private, and they produce a string of numbers, which is the leading economic indicator index. Moving on to the housing market. So there's a few different things we'll talk about here. We'll start off with housing prices and sales. And I'm going to distinguish three broad categories of agency that release this type of data. There is realtor data. That's the first type of agency that releases home prices and sales data. Realtor data it comes from MLS listing systems, so that's multiple listing service systems. These are computerized systems that track listings, sales, and prices of homes sold that the residential real estate brokerage houses use. And this computerized system allows them to create these data sets. So this data is the easiest to find, and mainly because it's the lowest cost. It has its downsides. It's a sample. It's not necessarily all transactions, just because some transactions might not make it into the system, and that could change over time. So that's a little bit of a note in care when you're using this data. The way the MLS system pulls the data from the actual transactions might change over time, particularly if they change the system, which they have to. It's a computerized system, right? Operating systems change, software changes, so they have to change the system every here and there. Maybe database system changes, that kind of thing. So that could lead to the data being pulled into the system in a slightly different way. So something to be mindful of when using this data. It is also subject to compositional changes. So if the type of homes that are being sold in one month changes a lot the next month, that'll lead to the data looking different, particularly prices. And an analyst might think, say, prices are higher in one month compared to another. They might think that overall housing prices have risen, but you need to be very careful when using this particular data because it has compositional changes in it. What do I mean by this? Suppose in November a lot of luxury homes sold, whereas in October they did not. It was more maybe starter homes. Then you're going to see a big price increase using this type of data. But that does not necessarily mean that the starter homes themselves from October to November, those prices rose a lot, or even that for the luxury homes from October to November, the prices rose a lot. This is an index of all of the homes, and if the share of luxury homes went up, then the November prices would be a lot higher. So the second promulgator of this type of data is what I call an accumulator. There are some companies, these are private companies, that collect this data. It's a lot of effort to collect this data. The company names are CoreLogic and DataQuick. I left both names there. They've actually recently merged. Actually, I don't know there was a merger. I believe CoreLogic bought DataQuick. But I left both names there in case some of you were familiar with one or the other in years past. I believe that the purchase was about 6 months ago. Could have been a little bit longer, 9 months ago. So because they collect every transaction, they go to county records, that kind of thing, and it's really a lot of work. They sell it, right? That's the only way they can survive. And so it is expensive. So what's good about it is it's not a sample. It's everything. It's like a census in a way, right? They gather the information on every single transaction that occurred, and they put it into the database system that generates these data. So that's good. It still has the issue that I discussed with realtor data of possible compositional changes, right? So if you're looking at median home prices over time, and I have a month where luxury homes sales as a fraction of all sales jumped dramatically, then of course you'll see a big price change, but it doesn't mean very much in that case. Third type of data, it's relatively recent. It's data that was started by a couple of academics, Carl Case and Robert Shiller. Robert Shiller's at Yale. He's a pretty famous guy. Carl Case is now getting kind of famous. They started it. It's now being distributed by a company that got started so that they can go back to their academic interests. What's interesting about this data is that it's free. It's high quality. Why is it high quality? Because they make an attempt to adjust for the type of home being sold, even changes in quality in the home being sold, right? So homes that have like wireless systems inside them are different than homes that don't have wireless systems inside them, for example, right? So that kind of home has more value embedded in it that should be capitalized in the price. And so we want to try to control for these things to make tracking price indicators over time more apples to apples. They try to do that. Couple of downsides, the data doesn't go as far back in time. Like, the Realtor data goes back to, I think, 1960, right? So that you can look at previous business cycles, right? So you can look at the business cycles that happened in the 70s, for example, using the Realtor data. You might not be able to do that with the Case-Shiller data because the data doesn't go that far back. Also, the Case-Shiller data comes out a bit more slowly after the fact as compared with Realtor data or the CoreLogic data. Okay, some examples of what I mean by compositional changes. Kind of talked about that already, but it's here on this slide. And here is a plot of growth rates, year-on-year percent change growth rates of single-family home median price indexes. The red line is from the National Association of Realtors for the United States. So that's Realtor data. And the yellow bars are Case-Shiller data. And you can see broadly over this entire sample, they kind of track each other. You can see the business cycle and that kind of thing. But you can also see that if you look carefully, for example, look at 2012, sort of early to mid 2012, the Realtor data, the line swings up quite a bit earlier than the Case-Shiller data with a little bit more strength at that time, indicating somewhat of a different pattern at that particular point in time. So there are differences in the data. Okay, another way analysts watch real estate is through building activity. It's a pretty interesting, important, and insightful type of data to look at in tracking a macroeconomy. This is national data. It's from the Census Bureau. While I'm not going to talk about it much, I'll just mention the Census Bureau does have some of this kind of data at local geographies like state and county and even city level in some cases. So going back to the national data, the data is available at various stages of what you might call construction. So a permit can be pulled. It doesn't mean that the builder has started building yet. It's just a permit that's been pulled. Then there's a start. Okay, that means they have started building. Then there's a completion. So this is a great data set that allows analysts to dig down into what's going on with new building activity. The data can be analyzed for residential markets as well as non-residential or commercial markets. Residential markets data tends to be measured in number of units, number of housing units. So how many housing units have been permitted or started or completed, whereas non-residential or commercial segment data is typically in dollar building value. Okay, so in such and such month for retail building space, there's X number billions of dollars of permit value, right? So it's not the size of the building. It's the value of the building in dollars for commercial data. Why is building activity important? A new building, residential or commercial, either way, has what we call a large multiplier. What is a multiplier? So the idea behind a multiplier is economists think about how economic activity in a particular industry is interlinked with economic activity in another industry or with commodities. So production of an automobile, for example, which is the auto industry, requires production in other industries. Otherwise, that automobile can't be produced, right? So an example of another industry that's impacted by the production of an automobile is the tire industry, right? Then there's the wheel industry, then there's the radiator industry, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different kinds of components that go into an automobile. So the production of another automobile impacts other industries and commodities like glass, steel, rubber, right? In particular way. Well, it's the same thing for a house. Houses or commercial buildings have steel, they have copper, they have various kinds of commodities in them, so it impacts commodities. They also impact other industries, right? There's industries that make heating and air conditioning systems that would be for a building. There's industries that make the appliances that might go into a building and various other things. In fact, in the case of a new building, there's a lot of impact. And that's why we say a new building has a large multiplier, quote unquote, is because there's really a lot of materials, there's really a lot of things like appliances and other things that go into a new building, so it has a large impact on the economy. Then, for the most part, a new building, a new house, or a new retail building, or whatever kind of building, it's mostly empty, right? There are a few appliances, perhaps, but there might not be any drapes, and generally there's little or no furniture, right? So there's even more to it in terms of the economic impact. When the house or the new industrial building or whatever it is occupied, there's going to be a lot of spending, some of it at retail establishments, some of it at general merchandise establishments, appliances, that kind of thing, to fill that new empty building with the necessary furniture and whatever else is needed for it to be used. So these economists were interested in building activity before the recent recession for this reason. One of the things that happened in the recent recession is macroeconomists realized that, hey, real estate is important to analyzing the macroeconomy, and so now it's watched even more closely. Okay, this is our last section in this unit. This is not monthly data like all the prior ones were in that last sort of subsection. This is weekly data. It's unemployment insurance claims. It's one of the few, if not the only, macroeconomic type indicator that's available at the weekly frequency, and that's partly why it's important. So it is considered a leading economic indicator. It was one of the items in the list in the previous section on leading economic indicators. It was the second item. Why is it considered a leading economic indicator? Well, if you have an accumulation of unemployment insurance claims, then because those are workers, right? And those workers, if they don't have a job, then, and as that accumulates, as more and more workers don't have jobs, as indicated by filing for unemployment insurance, then they might realize, well, I shouldn't be spending now because I don't really have the income to support that spending. So then their spending would fall. If their spending falls, then business inventories, retail establishment inventories would start rising. They would rise too fast. Then retail establishments will pull back on their inventory investment. Production companies would pull back on their production because the demand is not there. So for this reason, it's considered a leading indicator or forward-looking kind of indicator. What's also interesting about this indicator, which is different than some of the previous indicators, it is also available at the state level. Here's a chart for the United States starting in 2007. You can see, not surprisingly, that with the recession of 2008 and 9, the unemployment insurance claims grew pretty substantially, and they've been gradually declining ever since that time. That's it for the economic indicators section. Next up will be business cycles.